Hello, I'm Bob Pierce, Extension Tobacco and Hemp Specialist in the Plant and Soil Sciences Department at the University of Kentucky. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about site selection and soil fertility. So you've probably heard someone say about hemp that it'll grow anywhere. You can just put it on any type of soil and it's going to thrive. There may be a bit of truth to this, but in our experience so far, we've found that if we want to produce economically viable yields, whether we're growing fiber or grain or growing it for floral production for cannabinoids, that's going to require good soils and good management to be successful. So what we're going to talk about in this presentation is how we can go about selecting a good site and developing a fertility plan. We know from our experiences so far that the hemp grows best, like a lot of crops do, on well-drained soils with silt loam or loam textures. It can grow in other soil types as well, but it may take some additional management to be successful. Another thing that we know about hemp from our previous experience is that hemp is known to accumulate heavy metals. So we want to try to avoid sites that we know have high levels of heavy metals. This could include fallout areas from heavy industry like smelters or power plants. It could be sites that have had a history of municipal waste or wastewater applications where heavy metals would tend to build up. Yes, we can test for these in the soil. And I've had some growers ask me before or tell me that their processor had requested that they have a heavy metal test, and how do we interpret those results? The question is that we really don't know right now the best way to interpret those results, or what is that critical level that the metals need to be below in order to ensure we don't have problems. From a soil standpoint, I think it's probably more important that we also consider the pH, because the soil pH will determine the availability of those metals to the plant. And so even though we may have some metals there, if we have our pH in the right at the right zone, then a lot of those metals will not be available to the plants. So where can you find information about soils to help guide you in site selection? There are a number of sources. One of the best, I think, is probably the Web Soil Survey. And I've got a link there where you can go to this resource. Essentially what the Web Soil Survey has done is taken the old soil maps and digitized them so that you can go in and look at an area, define an area, and learn about the soils in that area. You can also go to the National Resources Conservation Service office in your area and get soil information, or your local cooperative extension office may be able to help as well. When we're looking at these soils, what are we looking for in terms of properties? Well, we've already mentioned drainage as being important. We want a well-drained soil. We'd like to have a soil with a low crusting potential because we've seen evidence that hemp is very susceptible to crusting. And we want to have areas that are level to moderate slopes. Right now, because we don't have a lot of options for weed control, most hemp production is being done with conventional tillage. And we don't want to do conventional tillage and expose those soils to erosion if they're on steep slopes. So we want to try to keep to level to moderate slopes for hemp production. So this is an example of what you can get from the Web Soil Survey. So you look at a map in the Web Soil Survey and you are able to define an area of interest, and the area of interest can be square, or you can tailor it to fit a specific site like this farm that we have outlined here. After you've outlined the area of interest, then you can go into the Soil Data Explorer tab, and it will give you information about the soils in that area. So the symbols in here tell us the name of the soil series, and in the Soil Data Explorer we could find out the drainage classification in many cases of that soil. We can find out other information about that soil. And they also have in the Soil Data Explorer information on the potential yields of crops on those various soils. So in this case, I've pulled up an example using burley tobacco as the index crop, because hemp is not in the system since it was not being grown at the time this system was developed. And what this does in the Data Explorer is give you a representation of the suitability of those soils for growing, in this case, burley tobacco, but they would also likely be very suitable for growing hemp as well. So these areas that are dark blue, this is a Shelbyville silt loam type soil. and you can see the yield rating on it compared to some of the other soils on this farm is quite high for burley tobacco. So those would be our highest yielding areas. The yellow is a soil called Lowell, and the Lowell Bs have a little higher productivity. The Lowell C is a similar soil but on a higher slope and has slightly less productivity. So this gives us an idea of soils that would be suitable in an area for growing hemp or perhaps other crops as well. But we need to understand there are some limitations of the soil survey information. Soil surveys, when they were done, were really intended for broad land use planning, not for pinpoint accuracy. So there's not a lot of site-specific information that is included. The other thing that you have to recognize about the way that these surveys were put together and these maps are done, we draw lines on there indicating boundaries between the different soil types. But if you walk out on that landscape, you're not going to find that one soil type ends immediately at that line and another type begins there. The changes are gradual and the boundaries are diffuse, and so you just can't expect to have, just a very fast change from one soil type to another. So a lot of the information that you take out of that, you use the soil survey to get an idea of maybe where you want to locate your field, but then you should verify with on-site information and observation of the area that the slopes are compatible, and then also do some soil testing, gather additional information on the site. So in extension, we always have to talk about soil testing, but when you're going to develop a fertility plan for any crop, and hemp is no different to that, you need to know what you're starting with. It's kind of like if you're going out to make a big purchase and not knowing the balance of your bank account before you do it. The soil test is what gives you the balance of what's in that soil that you can take advantage of, and then make sure that you're developing your plan to utilize that soil to the fullest extent. So very important part of soil testing is to get a good sample. You want to make sure that that sample is representative of the soil throughout the zone where the plant root zone is going to be, and also across the landscape. So these are some of the tools that are used for soil sampling. One of the most common is a soil core, which you push into the depth that you want, and then you can extract the core out. Soil augers are also useful for that. You go down to the depth that you want, and then you have the loose soil that's there. Or you can use a simple shovel and take a sample. But one of the things that we're illustrating here is that you need to trim that sample so that you are equally representing the upper and lower portions of the soil to the depth that you want to sample. In this illustration down here, we're showing that within a field, you may have different management zones. So for example, here you may have a higher sloping area. You may have part of a field that was limed and part was not, or maybe part was in corn and part was in soybeans. So you might want to divide those fields up into different management areas so that you understand the implications of those differences in the fertility level in those fields. Once you've kind of determined how many zones you want to sample, you want to collect at least 10 and maybe up to 25 or 30 cores for each sample area or for each zone that you're sampling in. And the reason for this, again, is that we want to represent the whole area, not just a specific spot within the soil. Samples should be taken to about 6 to 8 inches deep, or the depth that you're going to be doing tillage, because this is where the majority of the roots are going to be. After you've collected the 10 to 30 cores that you may need to represent that area, you want to put those into a large container or bucket. Break up the cores and by hand get that soil mixed up well, and put it into a sample bag. You can get sample bags from your county extension office. You can get the forms that you need to fill out, take those back to the county extension office, and they can send them to the lab on the campus for analysis. So after you've got your soil sample, you will get back a recommendation that talks about how much fertilizer to apply. In some cases, if you need lime, how much lime to apply. So some of the fertility questions you may be asking. How much fertility do I need? Well, first let's talk about sort of the big three nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or NPK. For the phosphorus and the potassium, we want to use soil tests for determining how much to apply. Currently, we don't have specific recommendations for hemp, but we feel like that the recommendations that we make for small grains or corn are very similar to what we might expect to need for hemp. So if you get a recommendation from the University of Kentucky at this point, it will be following our recommendations for small grains. And again, corn's very, very similar, but that way we make sure we get enough phosphorus and potassium to satisfy the needs of the plant. When it comes to nitrogen, nitrogen is mobile in the soil, and so a soil test is not a good way of predicting how much nitrogen would be available to the plant. Typically, the history of the field is a better way to predict nitrogen availability. If we have a field that was in sod or hay or pasture, and we're tilling that for the first time, we don't need to apply as much nitrogen because that sod, as it breaks down and those roots, they're going to release some nitrogen back to our crop. So we would use a little less in that situation as compared to if we were following a row crop. So we think that, somewhere between 50 to 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre would be what we would need for producing maximum biomass out of hemp, whether that's fiber or grain or floral biomass. We think that it's somewhere in that range. A good rule of thumb is probably about 150 units. You might go a bit higher if you knew you were on a soil, say where corn had been grown the previous year, and there was not a lot of organic matter there to replace that nitrogen. You might go on the lower side of that, the lesser amount. Again, if it's a site that's coming out of pasture or hay at the time. With nitrogen, it's probably a good idea to know what the processor says about that. Theoretically, you're going to have a contract with a processor to produce a product for them, and they may have some ideas as to how the nitrogen is going to affect that product. Perhaps the most important piece of information that you're going to get out of a soil test is how much lime to apply. Soil test will tell you how much lime you need to get that soil pH in a range of about 6 to 7, which is what we think is optimum for hemp production. pH is really important because it determines the availability of other elements and nutrients within the soil. So experience has taught us that most micronutrients are well balanced in that pH, and we can minimize the availability of a lot of the heavy metal elements by having the pH balance in the right place. One thing that we don't have a lot of information on at this stage is how does fertility impact the concentration of essential oils or essential cannabinoids like CBD, CBG, and of course THC as well. And I've had a lot of people express concerns about, well, if I apply too much nitrogen, is that going to cause the THC to spike and have my hemp become non-compliant? From what we've seen so far, we don't really think that's the case. Nitrogen doesn't seem to have that impact on cannabinoids. But we don't know the impact of the fertility of other elements, of nutrient stress. For example, we don't know the full impacts of that on the levels of these essential oils. One thing we are getting more information on is what do deficiency symptoms look like. And my colleagues at North Carolina State have recently published a paper. I've got a link here to that paper. It has some images and some pictures of what we might expect to see for different nutrient elements when they are deficient. And this helps us so that if you have a problem and you send us a picture or you send us a sample, we have at least an idea of what that nutrient deficiency looks like and what nutrient deficiency we might be dealing with. So I want to show you a little bit of the data that we've collected. This is just some preliminary data that we have looking at nitrogen rate in this case, specifically on grain yield. And so we had 0, 50, 100, or 200 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre applied to this field. It was applied either as a pre-plant or as a split application. and then what we're measuring here is grain yield. And you can see that as we increase the nitrogen rate, as expected, we see some increase in yield. And this is pretty similar to what we might see for a small grain or a corn yield in response to increasing nitrogen. And it looks like we had a pretty steady increase up to 100 units, and then after that, it leveled off somewhat in this case. So again, that's where we're coming up with these recommendations for nitrogen rates somewhere between 50 and 200 as being the optimum. We need to do more work in order to fine-tune those recommendations and figure out exactly how much nitrogen that we need. If we look at the impact of nitrogen fertility on floral production, it's very interesting, at least with some of the early data that we've got, there seems to be some interaction between nitrogen fertility and floral production. So again, we have the same rates of nitrogen here. All of this was applied as a pre-plant. All of our P and K levels were completely satisfied, so we're just looking at really the impact of nitrogen here. And we see with some varieties, like the Futura and the Fedora, with each increment of nitrogen, even all the way up to 200, we're increasing some yield there with those particular cultivars. However, if we look at another cultivar like the Victoria, we have a little bit of an increase between 0 and 50 in terms of floral production, and then it seemed like it leveled off. So that suggests that there may be some differences in how the varieties are going to react to nitrogen fertility. The Victoria may in fact be more efficient at utilizing nitrogen than some of the other cultivars that we tested. But again, this is something that we need to see repeated over different locations and with different cultivars to see if that holds true. So my take-home lesson for developing a soil fertility plan for hemp is soil test. You've got to have the information if you're going to make good choices about soil fertility. Now in 2019, we did see a lot of nutrient deficiencies out in the field. And ultimately we found that many of these were caused by poor root development from the plants that we were growing. And one key to this was the fact that these plants would grow along until they reached a certain size, and then it seemed like they just hit a wall. And they started showing all these deficiency symptoms. And these are some actual soil test and plant analysis data from a grower who's experiencing this problem. And the soils are showing generally fairly adequate levels of nutrients, but the plants are deficient in almost everything on the list. And that's an indicator that we're not really dealing with a problem in nutrient deficiency. We need to look at what else might be causing that. Could be disease, or could be some other problems there. But one of the things that we found in many of these cases were concerns with the root systems of cloned plants. We saw a number of instances of girdling root, where the roots actually wrapped around the stem of the plant itself and essentially choked it. We had a lot of examples of poorly developed root systems. When these cuttings are taken to be turned into these clones, we have one shot to establish some primary roots on that, and if we don't get those established early on, that plant's going to struggle. And again, has a root system to get it up through the small stages, but once the plant reaches a certain size, it's going to start to struggle. Fortunately, we did see that if managed properly, cuttings can produce good roots. Here we see a number of lateral roots. We have some roots that are going down deeper into the soil as well, and a strong root system that overall is going to be able to support that plant as it grows. One of the lessons that we've learned out of that is that how we produce these plants really matter. So if you're purchasing cuttings or if you're purchasing clones, you want to take a good look at those plants. Work with that plant producer to try to ensure that you get a good quality plant. Last year there was so much demand for planting materials that people were turning out plant materials very quickly. And in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, I think quality was not as good as it could have been. Certainly, if we had plants like this that were going out they would struggle more so than a plant with a good root system when placed into an outside environment. So my take-home lesson for sourcing of planting materials then is to make sure you obtain good quality clones or transplants, and that will help you avoid some of these problems with nutrient. So I hope that was helpful and useful for you to learn about soils and about soil fertility for hemp. Be sure to check out some of our other programs on other aspects of hemp production.